This is what we call the policy pitches. And what we're trying to do in this session is to give you a fast-paced and interesting, but very insightful interaction with some of the ESPON research that's been done by the brilliant research teams over the past few months. And the way we're going to essentially work it is this. We're using the format that's a little bit like, let's say, Dragon's Den, or what I think is sometimes called the shark, what is it, the shark chamber, something like that. We're going to invite each of the representatives of the research teams to come to the stage and take just 3 minutes using the music guillotine that I explained to you earlier, just 3 minutes to give you a pitch about the policy implications of the research that they've been doing for ESPON. We're going to cluster them in certain groups, so we'll be doing ones to do with the economy first, then we'll move on to ones to do with governance and planning, and then from that we'll move to the low-carbon, circular, renewable theme. After a certain group of pitchers have pitched, I'll be introducing our panel, who will give their personal interactions and reflections on what they've heard. And then immediately after they've done that, I'll be asking you to join in and to participate in the conversation. I'll shortly introduce the panel to you. During that part of the session, when you're interacting, we'll be using Slido both for you to ask questions, make observations, favorite things that have been said by others, and for you to engage by making points and debating. The key question that underlines all of this is how can we get good policy recommendations out of our research, and at what level would particular policy recommendations work well or not so well. So in a minute I'll start to introduce the pitchers. Let me first now introduce our distinguished panel. So immediately on my left is Željka Uzgaga, who's from DG Regio. Sitting next to her is Maria Ginetti from the ESPON project team. Next to her is Anina Eggenberger from the Swiss Federal Office for Spatial Development. Next to her, David Hope from Coventry City Council. And next to him, Peter Austin from the City of Oslo. So please, will you welcome our panel of judges. Now, I'll be asking them questions such as which of the policy messages you've heard resonate with you, or which current policy processes could benefit from the research that you've heard about, or what do you see as the barriers, for example, in implementing the recommendations that you've just heard. So, we're going to go immediately into the first session of the pitches. 3 minutes per pitch. We're taking a group of them now that are to do with economy and employment. The first pitch is going to be on the subject of the geography of new employment dynamics in Europe, the Employment Project, and I'm delighted to welcome to the stage, and I'm going to ask you to give her a big welcome, Manuela Samek-Lodovici from the Istituto per la Ricerca Sociale. Manuela, the floor is yours. Green is forward.
Okay, thanks. I'll try to say everything in 3 minutes. We analyzed the role of the knowledge economy in affecting high-skilled labor mobility, but also territorial disparities. The knowledge economy is concentrated in urban areas with very good levels of scientific institution, high educational level of the population, good ICT, transport, education, and other infrastructure, which provide very good living standards. The problem is that this concentration means that areas that do not have a knowledge economy basis are lagging behind and the risk to lose in comparison with these more urbanized areas. As you can see here, we did a cluster analysis. The red areas are those very highly competitive and knowledge-based economies, which are mainly in big metropolitan areas. The two intermediate levels, the orange and green levels, are less competitive, but with some potential for knowledge economy, and the blue areas are those lagging behind. What happened comparing the before and after the crisis, what happened was that the knowledge economy is increasing its role as a pull factor for high-skilled labor mobility and growth, and also for increasing territorial disparities. During this period, about 50 regions in the two in-between clusters, the orange and the green one, have been worsening their position. They shift from like cluster 2 to cluster 3, or from cluster 3 to cluster 4, while only 15 improved their position. Conversely, those in cluster 1 and in cluster 4, the best ones in terms of knowledge economy, and the worst one, didn't change. So there is also a path dependency in this. So what can we say about future cohesion policy and policy implication? We think cohesion policy should start supporting more lagging areas in order to reduce these disparities. Lagging areas are not able to attract private investments as growing urban areas. So they need public support, they need public funding. How could these policies support lagging areas? Well, the first thing is place-based, as we all know, which means valorize local assets, which can be also environmental, cultural assets. Provide services and infrastructure. This is crucial. Accessibility, education, and so on, and capacity building for local stakeholders and local administration. This is crucial also, but this also needs multi-level governance. In the case studies we did, success stories had interaction and cooperation between European, national, and local institutions.
Bravissima! Manuela, you're a very good sport and very brave, and your presentation was fantastic, but just over 3 minutes. But never play music when an Italian lady's speaking, right? Not a good idea. Very good. Okay, so now we go to small and medium enterprises, and our speaker here is going to be Bernd Schur from OIR. Bernd, come and join us. The floor is yours for 3 minutes only.
Good. Okay, never play music with an Austrian either. So, my presentation is about the SME project. The issue was analyzing the distribution and performance of small and medium-sized enterprises in European regions and proposing the territorial development strategies on it. Why does it matter? It matters because what we can see, and we know anyway, SMEs are the backbone of European economy. You have literally thousands and thousands of them. And in order to understand the performance, you need, of course, to take into account in which territorial settings they are operating, what are the structures in the labor market, and what are the different enterprises in terms of their size classes. And there we are already at the biggest challenge we were facing is, and you can see that actually from the gray zones in this map, that we have no common understanding of where does an enterprise become a small enterprise, become a micro enterprise, and when does it start to be a medium one? So we tried our best to fill the data gaps in this respect by our own collection of data, and we were honored to be the only data set from ESPON which is included now in the cohesion report on the sheer availability of SMEs. What you can see here is that the complexity of the issue, that you have various territorial settings in combination with the existence of small and medium-sized enterprises. There is no clear-cut pattern, which you can see actually from this map, to combine territorial settings with the types of enterprises and with the size classes and also of the survival rates. So the recommendations will be, first of all, there are no tailor-made solutions for unique regions, so you have to understand before you intervene in regions the governance in place. We have seen that the governance settings are a crucial element there, and there is no guarantee that even in a very open setting, so to say, everything is fine and open. You need to encourage also and to include not only the triple helix approach, but you have to go further and to involve people more often, because micro enterprises start off from people. They start off from the population in place, and this has to be taken into account as well when talking about innovation and so on. Then we have to differentiate between startups and scale-ups. They have different needs and they need to be addressed separately. And then last but not least, you have to concentrate rather on the skills and competencies than on the sector policies.
Woo. So if Bernd had a band, it would be called Bernd Schur and the Quadruple Helix, wouldn't it? So that would be great for the next hit. The third in our sequence of economic presentations is The World in Europe. And please welcome Julian Grunfelder from Nordregio.
Okay, so time is up. So I have 3 minutes to present you some of the findings we've found out with Copenhagen Economics, the lead partner of this project. And so what do we know about FDI in Europe, and more precisely extra EU FDI? We know that it employs 5 times more people than local firms. It produces 11 times more, and it generates 9 times as much added value than local firms. What else do we know? We know that FDI has different kinds of effects. It has direct effects like job creation. It has indirect effects just as development of infrastructure and also the local economy, and also induced effects like the wage spent by the population employed by those firms. And we know this more generally, but the idea was to find out how this is distributed across a European region in that case. And that's one of the outputs. That's the map of extra European FDI inflow across European region during the last 12 years. And the main observation is, of course, that when it comes to the values, most of this investment happen in urban and capital city regions. However, we can see some smaller differences, and that's, for instance, linked to the fact that FDI investment is quite important when you have the source and the target industry having the same business cultures. For instance, you have a lot of investment to both Ireland and the UK, and that's due, for instance, that most of the extra EU FDI inflows to Europe originate from the US, so they have a lot of ties when it comes to business cultures in that case. And how we mapped that, it was based on more than 50,000 extra EU FDI projects and more than 100,000 non-European owned firms in Europe. And also the analysis has been further developed with 7 case studies in 7 European countries. And one of the conclusions was that one thing that is very important in having extra EU FDI was the existence of clusters and also collaboration between, for instance, universities and also the so-called hidden champions that you can find in many parts outside the capital cities of Europe. And also what is quite important is to use existing strengths. We don't have to start strategy from scratch, but use the assets of the region that is already there and that might be relevant for investors. And finally, special initiatives will also support disadvantaged regions, and that's basically infrastructure to help getting better access to these regions outside the capital cities.
Thank you, Julian.
Yeah.
Wonderful. Thank you very much to our first 3 pitchers. So, panel, that was the 3 economics pitchers. And Now you should start to make your notes, be ready for the discussion that will come later when I'll ask you which of the pitches resonates most with your policies, which are the policy processes that can benefit from this, what are the potential barriers to implementing some of these things. And you in the room, you should start to think about, from the pitches that you're hearing, which are the policy recommendations that you like the most, because you'll be voting on this a little bit later on. Which policy recommendation do you think would have the biggest impact in your region? Who has given you the most inspirational or persuasive pitch? So you should be making notes as well. Okay, so we're now going to go to our next set of pitches, which are broadly within the theme of planning and governance. And the first of these is going to be about cooperation areas. And to give this pitch, we're going to have Erik Gleason from Spatial Foresight GmbH. So Erik, welcome. The floor is yours.
Thank you. So I'm going to talk about soft territorial cooperation. So what is this? Well, to try to make it more obvious, we like to refer to it as a community of intent, which is really about taking seriously its dialectic relationship between actors and territory. Basically, actors come together because it makes sense to address the issues they are confronted to. Functional integration may play a role in that who comes together, but the functional area is just as much created as it is a given. That's really what it's about, is they are creating the functionality around the issues through the partnerships. What does this imply when we're analyzing? What does it bring? It is full of promises, we find. We find that it brings, going through these initiatives across Europe, we find the basis for a new approach to territorial cohesion, focusing on processes and methods much more than on policy objectives. So territorial cohesion should be more about looking at how do you take decisions, how do you implement them. Secondly, as I mentioned, it allows us to revisit the notion of functional area as something that is created, that is multiple, and that is evolving all the time. Functionality is changing all the time. So actors come together in these changing areas over limited time, they address their issues, and they may adapt the area as they go. Which brings then the issue of when do you bring coherence into this? When do you bring this together into some coherent across sectors, across issues? So the usefulness, the necessity of having these hard traditional regions becomes very obvious. You need them in addition to these soft initiatives to bring in the coherence. Which then brings us to the future of cohesion policy. How can you think cohesion policy taking on board all these actor dynamics of soft cooperation? Precisely by letting the regions as they are manage programs as they are currently, but having a role of interaction, having almost an obligation of interacting with these soft cooperation initiatives that are really adapted to the evolving, changing functional territories. So if I can just very briefly go through three key policy recommendations on how that is done. How do the regions, how do the national authorities, European authorities support it? They need to focus on capacity building and facilitation. It is not obvious for actors in the regions, in the local authorities to have the knowledge, capacities, resources to build a consensus building process, to really bring actors together and acting together. This requires training, knowledge on how it is done. Secondly, for this to happen, you need some basic funding. So we're not saying you need some kind of dedicated scheme to give money to these cooperation bodies. They will find it. If they are dynamic, if they have a need, they will find it. But you do need to have these facilitators who have the resources to keep it going, to keep the process floating. Third thing, we need to reflect on what role do public authorities play at different levels. Europe can be agenda setting. The national authorities can also play saying that this is important. Regional levels can engage in a dialogue with soft cooperation authorities, and local levels can use it as a leverage for their policy development. Thank you.
Erik, thank you. It is simply amazing how all of our brilliant speakers are managing to say a lot in 3 minutes, and we're very grateful for their efforts to do so. Our next pitch concerns metropolitan areas, spatial dynamics and strategic planning. Please welcome Vanya Simeonova from Stettin-Wageningen Research Altera. So, Vanya, the floor is yours.
Hello, everybody. This project studied the challenges of the emerging metropolitan developments across Europe. and how these developments affect spatial planning practices across Europe in different cases, 10 cities across Europe. The problem is that there is no one single definition of a metropolitan area. So we looked at these interesting cases across Europe, how, where the gaps are, how the administrative management of territorial development is done, and what actually is happening there in these territories in functional aspects. So we try to make this more clear and evident. We developed, by tailoring different types of delineations, methodologies across the cities, but also looking into European experiences, we tailored a method, which is called Metropolitan Development Area Delineation Method, in order to assess the key urban trends in these 10 cases across Europe, and also try to see what are the most important spatial scales to address metropolitan developments. And that is different for each of the cases. So we try to develop also a typology that shows these different categories and concepts of delineation of metropolitan areas and also the processes that are happening around them. One of our key findings is that effective metropolitan planning depends on a shared governance. It's a governance process that's across the levels and across the policy issues. So we call it vertical and horizontally horizontal approach. It has to fit the statutory planning, the planning procedures that are happening at the moment in different municipalities within these metropolitan areas, which is not always the case at the moment. So it requires a very dynamic, iterative governance process. And next to that, it is not always that you need additional regulations or formalization processes of these metropolitan areas, but you need a very strong governance model that ensures that there is a collaboration between all these municipalities to manage such a big area. We developed a systematic approach to address this issue and to give our stakeholders and maybe other cities in Europe some kind of a direction. This is our metropolitan planning approach. It's kind of a test within our project. It's based on 8 action areas for selecting different foci in strategic, statutory, and collaborative planning. And all these action areas are, you can call it steps or phases, which you have to address if you want to have an ultimate metropolitan planning approach. Another key message for the policymakers is that you have to think of metropolitan areas as clusters of different administrative bodies, and you have to understand how they have to collaborate in the best structure and the process. And the last and most important maybe at this moment in this issue is engaging political leaders and gaining support at all levels of governance, national, regional, and local. We need some more flexibility here, not more regulations, and a strong leadership. That's all.
Vanya, thank you very much. Thank you. The next focus is on territorial governance, where we're looking at comparative analysis of territorial governments and spatial planning systems in Europe. Please welcome Vincent Nadin from the Technical University in Delft.
My story begins by saying that in our work on territorial planning, territorial development in Europe, we don't pay enough attention to spatial planning. Town and country planning, city and regional planning, environmental planning, call it what you will, it has many forms, but we need to pay more attention to that. I'm fortunate in being able to lead the first project since 1997, which is taking a view across Europe on the state of our spatial planning systems. It's a little bit different to the previous project then. It's a long project. At this moment, we're only in the analysis stage. We don't have a draft final report yet. I see this as a first step to looking at the effectiveness of spatial planning systems in Europe. Why does that matter? Because spatial planning is critical for more effective and coordination of implementation of EU policies. It's the first stop for thinking about coordination and cooperation. And I'm disappointed to see that often we stray from that. In the document we were discussing this morning on shrinking rural regions, I was very pleased to see that it calls for multi-scale integrated strategic spatial planning, but then goes on to say we need to establish specialized cross-sectoral agency or an expert authority. I would say that we need to pay more attention to our existing spatial planning systems. We won't be preparing many maps in our project, but I will mention, and this is just the map of Europe, the variation in the way that spatial planning is undertaken in Europe. There are so many different systems and they're culturally rooted. Nevertheless, we do know that our performance is poor, and apologies for picking on 3 countries here, but we know that our management, our effective management of the territory is weak. We see urban sprawl, we see difficulties in the cities and urban renewal, a loss of habitats, problems with rural regions, congestion in the cities. We're not making a very good job of it. The list could be longer. So we set up with the project here to look at the different spatial planning systems, taking into account the variation across Europe. I have 3 recommendations at this stage. Avoid spatial blindness. Well, that's been said before, it's not new, but we must investigate this through spatial planning, giving planning a particular role. We must avoid the costs of non-coordination. Again, that's not a new phrase, but it's something we really need to pay attention to. This will require adaptation and reform of planning systems. And then finally, we need to monitor the effectiveness of spatial planning. I would like to see a name and shame approach, a league table of the effectiveness of spatial planning systems in Europe. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed. Just while we wait for our next speaker, who else would like to see a name and shame league table of the effectiveness of spatial planning systems in Europe? If you would, raise your hands. Okay, if you wouldn't, raise your hands. If you're too scared to vote, raise your hands. Okay. Nearly. Okay. Next, we're going to talk about Innerperipheries, and it's a great pleasure to welcome Joan Noguera from the Universidad Valenciana.
Thank you very much. Okay, our project, well, my name is Joan Noguera, coming from the University of Valencia. We lead the project on innerperipherality. Innerperipherality is a complex phenomenon that entails the socioeconomic disadvantage due to disconnection from neighboring territories and beyond. Innerperiphery has 4 territorial expressions, and it's present in all types of territories in Europe, from enclaves of metropolitan areas to remote rural areas. So there is not any type of territory safe from becoming an inner periphery. If this is true, an inner peripherality is already extended around Europe, and we think it is, we better have an eye on this phenomenon to prevent and act on its causing triggers and drivers. Because once established, inner peripherality causes disadvantages that are reinforced over time in its multiple causes, and if its multiple causes are not identified and acted upon. For example, the loss of services, poor connectivity with other regions and with centers of power, poor social capital, etc. The project, Prophecy, provides the necessary tools to counteract the marginalization effects of inner peripherality. Where is your region in terms of inner peripherality through delineations, policy approaches and strategies to overcome inner peripherality disadvantage, and learning tools like the project's handbook, for instance. The perfect combination for inner peripherality is this: low economic potential, poor access to services of general interest, and weak organized proximity. You can see that in this map. So The phenomenon is extending in Europe, and what you see is the dominance of one or one of the drivers, but that doesn't mean that this is the only driver acting in the area. So usually inner peripherality is the result of the combination of all the three drivers acting together: poor socioeconomic situation and economic potential, lack of access to centers or services, or poor accessibility. So the message is it is a lot about connectivity and territorial capital to facilitate neo-endogenous development. Then the orientation of strategies needs to go beyond tangible assets to act also on shaping intangible factors, such as community relations and social norms. Those are pivotal in bringing change. And finally, overcome limited views and realize the potential of inner peripherality to serve as laboratories for alternative in socioeconomic processes. Thank you.
Thank you. Joan Noguera and the inner peripheralities. Let's now go, if we may, to regional strategies for sustainable and inclusive territorial development. Please welcome Kevin Broughton from Coventry University.
We need extra wine at the dinner, by the way. Okay. I'm presenting the findings from the RESI project, which explores how regional and local authorities collaborate. This isn't working. Oh, there we go. Oh, still it. Which explores how regional and local authorities collaborate to promote smart, sustainable and inclusive development as prioritised by EU 2020. The research explores...
It's here.
Oh,
No, there's your
sorry.
screen. Yeah.
It's not working. Sorry.
That's it. You press that one.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
The research explores the realities of promoting development during a time of dramatic change in regional governance, from few stakeholders to many, from stability to uncertainty, from government to governance. To do this, we explored 7 regional or local case study projects in 4 different countries: the UK, Denmark, Italy and Portugal. The case studies include environmental improvement projects, regional strategies and digital innovations in transport. All of these projects require collaboration across administrative boundaries and across different scales of governance, reflecting the wider issues here. Our analysis found the case studies were primarily about territorial development or about sectoral development. Also, the means available to the cases, i.e. their powers and resources, were largely hard means, statutory-based infrastructures, dedicated funding, or soft means, frameworks based on communication and voluntary links with little funding. So our analysis classified each case study into one of 4 categories, as shown by the grey circles. And these categories help to offer more contextually appropriate good practice suggestions for others. First, we suggest that local or regional authorities should exploit their existing tacit knowledge by being a broker of project-relevant alliances. Second, as with previous research, we identified how the momentum of territorial programme implementation and the collaboration that comes with it can be lost when core funding ends. Given those realities, more flexible strategies are needed which can evolve to align with other strategies via territorial collaboration with other relevant vertical and horizontal networks. We also suggest that authorities move beyond the hard role of ensuring compliance to that of facilitating trust as part of developing softer networks for territorial development. And finally, we suggest that authorities navigate tensions between sectoral and territorial development frameworks by exploiting sectoral innovations for wider territorial benefit. For example, by promoting cities or regions as living labs for innovative products and services. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Well done, Kevin, and you avoided the musical guillotine. So
I am
very
a dinosaur.
So, panellists, you've now heard all of the presentations that relate to the planning and governance theme. and you should be thinking about your reflections upon those. And we'll move now to the two presentations that are going to address the environmental, the circular, and the renewable agenda. What I don't know is whether it's Bernd or Eric who's going to speak now. It's Bernd again. So that's fantastic. So territories and the low carbon economy. Please welcome again Bernd Schur.
Thank you very much. I'm replacing here Christoph Schremmer and his team, who sends his regards, and I will be then as brief as before, presenting the results from the low carbon economy or LOCATE project. It was looking at the region's transition to a low carbon economy with a focus on energy, both consumption and production. It is irrelevant because it shows that regions' energy consumption and renewable energy and governance potentials are somehow combining with each other and are the important issues to be considered in parallel. First, of course, in terms of energy production, it was remarkable that the project for the first time really created Europe-wide maps on a regional scale in terms of renewable energy production methods. And on the one hand, it was remarkable to see that, for instance, one type of renewable energy, the wind energy, for instance, was to be found mostly in those areas which are actually better suited for that, meaning the most wind exposed regions. Well, on the other hand, other renewable energy technologies, like for instance PV, so photovoltaic generation, is not necessarily placed mostly in those areas who are favorable for that, meaning the southern regions or those who are exposed to more sunshine, but they are rather to be found in northern regions, which means that there is a gap apparently between the application, the willingness to apply these technologies, and the favorable conditions. So the key advice would be that, and this is of course very difficult to establish because governance, as we know in the energy sector, is a highly complex thing, which is still to a large degree dominated by national and even regional interests and given conditions. So this means that they need appropriate governance powers in issues like renewable energy in order to overcome these barriers which are dominated by the structure of energy providers mostly. Then second is, of course, that local regional cooperation is then the key for that, because a lot of these issues are, of course, only to be solved there, and the broad involvement of the public sector is needed. So this means that tailor EU national level legal aid frameworks need to be established in order to overcome actually this rigidness of the framework. The impact of cohesion policy has to be increased by integrating the policy fields, especially economy and energy sector, which is very difficult, as I said, because you have then to overcome the national barriers in there. And that's it.
Great. Well done, Bernd. You've surpassed even your previous performance. Very good. Our final presentation is Possible European Territorial Futures. Please welcome Kai Bohm from Spatial Foresight GmbH. Kai, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon. Well, possible territorial futures. So how do you go about? And the question mainly was, what might the European territory look like in 2030? And I guess we started off with the standard and saying, well, there is a little bit more of concentration of GDP, a little bit more of concentration of population, all those things you know already. In the report, there's one map, which I don't show you. You have to download the report, I'm sorry, which is about the impact of European disintegration. So what happens if Europe is less integrated than today? But beyond going to what the European territory look like, we had to answer a few more specific questions, which are very fuzzy, and I come back to them. And for that, we applied an approach which is not usual for ESPON. We looked into territorial foresight. And now you may reset your mind and say, well, it's not about data and it's not about modeling and that much. It's really about critical lateral thinking for long-term developments, and put that in a territorial perspective and put that more in a participatory approach. So we talked to a lot of people and had really the participatory part of it and the development of the methodology. And here are then in the three questions we got from ESPON to answer, saying, what would Europe look like in 2030 if we had a fully place-based circular economy? Question 2, what would Europe look like in 2030 if by 2030 we had 100% renewable energy Europe? And what would Europe look like by 2030 if all property markets just would collapse? Here you go. So what would Europe look like? Which data sets do you use? Which model? And how does it work? So the first part was to develop actually a methodology, saying we need to frame the topics. What is really a fully place-based circular economy? What does it imply? Et cetera, et cetera. We need to look into ESPON reports, into facts, and figure out, territorial variation of that, facts are pretty shaky. So we run very detailed, very elaborated participatory processes and had a very developed methodology for that, which is actually the main output of the project, a handbook of how to do territorial foresight, and looked into exposure sensitivity, borrowing things from ÖR and their territorial impact assessment. The results are basically a territorial foresight guide, which all of you can use once it's online, and a picture of Europe today and to tomorrow and the foresight reports on the different topics. I think the main advice is you might have a perfect policy objective that sounds lovely, but it might have different territorial implications and might be less lovely in one place and more lovely in another. Here's a part on the circular economy, just showing you also that plays out differently. In general, we would advise you to engage people in territorial foresight at any administrative level for any topic, so don't limit it to Europe or to certain topics. And finally, go beyond what is in the data and consider this participatory elements, those things that cannot be measured, where you don't have data that's for. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Well, ladies and gentlemen, you've heard from our 10 rather brilliant pitchers, and before we go any further, let's give them another round of applause. Thank you very much indeed. It's something of a Philistine activity to ask people who've been researching huge topics for large portions of their lives to summarize everything they think is relevant for policy in 3 minutes. And they did so well, and with our grateful thanks. I'm now going to ask our panel to reflect. And the way we're going to do this is that we'll start with the economy and employment projects. I'll ask the panel to reflect for no more than about a minute and a half each on what they heard. Then they can raise questions if they want to raise questions. Then we'll have some comments and some thoughts from people in the room. You can do that through Slido, or we'll even allow you to raise your hands as well. We'll have a little bit more discussion with the panel, and then we'll invite the three pitchers in the economy and employment space to have a quick right of reply, the microphone for 30 seconds each or something like that. And then we'll do the same thing with governance and planning. And we'll discuss that with the panel. You'll interact. We'll invite the speakers to come back into the conversation. Then we'll do the same thing with the environment and the circular economy and the renewables as we go. And then roughly we'll get to about 3:45, 10 to 4. And at that point, I'm going to ask everybody in the room to do their votes. And then at about 2 minutes to 4, in an Oscars-style ceremony, the winners of the various votes will be announced, and we look forward to that. So panelists, let's begin. We're going to talk about the employment and economy themes. I want to know something about which ones resonated with you, which policy processes could benefit from the work. What do you think some of the barriers might be to implementing the ideas shared? And Željka, you're going to go first. And there's a microphone, or there it is now. Okay, we're going to share microphones.
Is it working?
Yes, it is.
Great. I wasn't aware that you're going to limit our interventions as well to even less time than the pictures. That's not fair.
About
There's
90
a lot
seconds,
to
and then
here.
the music will begin, Željka. So,
Okay. Several of these pitches, especially the one under the employee study and after the FDI study, refer to lagging regions and how cohesion policy should play a greater role there. Let me say that cohesion policy already plays an important role in lagging regions, and it accounts for a high share of the public investment. Our commissioner took a personal interest in lagging regions and was in the lead of our lagging regions initiative, which kind of came to the same conclusions as the first study, that human capital should be further enhanced. We also want to overcome the obstacle by the virtue of our smart specialization strategies, be it a triple helix or a quadruple helix. But we consider this to be a good tool. We also would like to reduce gaps in infrastructure and invest in human capital, and link cities better with the hinterlands into kind of functional areas where the services of general interest could be pulled together. However, taking lagging regions to an additional higher level of economic development cannot be accomplished by one-size-fits-all policy, but will require regional differentiation and regional policy responses. I come to the SME study messages. Of course, the additional differentiation would certainly happen at the national level, because the cohesion policy provides only the overall general framework within the national governments choose their priorities. So further differentiations is expected to happen at that level. They could improve the business framework and facilitate both startups and scale-ups separately if needed and as recommended. And they could also boost up national institutional framework and business environment. This is actually of paramount importance.
Great.
Was it a minute and a half?
Just about. Thank you very much. The music didn't begin. So thank you very much, Jelka, and I appreciate it's difficult to synthesize these considered views very quickly. Maria, your reflections, please.
Thank you. I work primarily in enterprise policy in the Department of Enterprise and Innovation in Ireland. And one of our key objectives is to ensure that we realise the potential of our regions. And I suppose one of the messages throughout these three really resonate with me, because I think we're trying to shift mindsets from concepts of regional or distribution and attribution or allocation of population growth to regions, to realising the potential and leveraging the territorial assets. So I think from that perspective, each of them resonated in that regard. I think for me, again, as you know, in Ireland, we have had great success with foreign direct investment. And again, what I keep coming back to is that sort of chicken and egg situation. So businesses will be attracted to areas in which they can have access to markets, access to knowledge capital, access to technologies and innovation. So there is a real question for those regions that are identified as disadvantaged or lagging in terms of how do they best identify and leverage their own territorial assets so that they can become attractive for business investment. And in Ireland, I suppose what we want to think about as well is not just business investments in terms of FDI, but also in terms of entrepreneurship, startups and scaling. And that again is where the SME study, I think, was interesting in identifying the need to tailor interventions to the differing needs of startups and scaling companies. So maybe I'll leave it at that for the moment.
Great, thank you very much, Maria. So in a sense, you've raised two very important questions, and somebody might put these up on Slido for us, but one is, how can disadvantaged regions really organize to succeed in FDI? You were just commenting on that. And the second one is really, how do you know what kind of SMEs you're dealing with? If you've got these life cycle dynamics or these different sectoral dynamics, how do you know what you're dealing with? So maybe we can have those questions added. Anina, your reflections, please.
Thank you very much. So I think it's important to state that, first of all, Switzerland is just a partner state, so all the cohesion policy recommendations for us are, of course, very interesting, but at the same time, we're quite far away from the whole cohesion policy reflections. So employment dynamic-wise and SME, of course, those are two big reflections that also exist in Switzerland. We have a big SME culture, And we have many universities working with economy and trying to create local clusters. So I think one of the things Switzerland is trying to do is not to have the one university city where all expertise is in one specific place, say Zurich or Geneva, but really have a lot of different competence poles throughout whole Switzerland, and those universities then would work with the SMEs on place. So I think we've worked on this also on a policy level. We have several strategies on trying to diversify as much as possible our academia knowledge connected with enterprises, and yeah, I think on foreign direct investment, I'm not gonna reflect on this too much, because I think Switzerland is also kind of a special case in that regard. So I'm gonna hand over to David.
Great, thank you very much indeed. David, your thoughts?
Is that working, that one?
Yep.
Cool. Yeah, so my eyes were drawn very quickly to the very first map that got posted, that had my home region, the West Midlands, coloured in green as a region just basically not exploiting its capability as a knowledge economy. Particularly given that on paper our region has a world-class innovation ecosystem. So I also resonated. Never mind. I also resonated very clearly with the recommendations as well from the SME pitch, which was, very much around the fact that, needing to get a system, SMEs simply need support to grow and to innovate. The market does not address it on its own, certainly not in the UK, but also the fact that there is a need for, there is a need for longer-term funding streams to be introduced to allow time for SMEs, even working with the public sector, to develop and test new innovations and to understand the impact. And although I agree with the point made about possibly needing separate support policies for startups and scale-ups, I always think it's important to consider the customer journey. How do you support a business from starting up to growing to scaling up? Thinking about which support model works best, it's both on an EU level and you can break it down nationally. And also, where does the role of inward investment support fit in? And just finally, I think in determining those support models, you need to consider what's the role of local authorities, and also where do universities and national government and other key public-private stakeholders fit within the process.
Great. David, thank you very much indeed. Before Peter speaks, let me remind everyone in the room, we want your questions, we want your statements and points. Send them to us on Slido. You can favourite or prioritise each other's comments and points, and we can take things forward from there. Peter, your reflections.
Yeah.
Keep going.
Thanks very much to the researchers. This work is very interesting. I think we'll gain a lot from this. Oslo, where I work, is a relatively small peripheral capital, much like Tallinn. The economic development policy where we are is based on an awareness of key industrial clusters. And in that context, a lot of the work we do is based on supporting a broader startup environment. So the SME picture that was painted, I think, is very important in the context of also a number of big metropolitan areas. On the employment analysis, I was particularly struck looking at the question of resonance on the mobility patterns that were shown. It was only part of the map. There were lots of shades of green, but there are huge areas of Europe which were shown hatched on the map where there's a lot of migration issues for skilled workers leaving countries, especially Central Eastern Europe and the Iberian Peninsula. I would like to see that analysis maybe pushing forward and maybe for the first time looking at the scale of the risk for these regions where people are migrating from, especially people with higher qualifications. We're not challenging the migration policy per se for Europe, but of course there are big risks involved here, which have now gone a long way. This part of Europe has lost about, where we are now, has lost about 25% of its population since 2004. This is colossal. And this has to be addressed as a risk. And I think the economic questions now have to be asked how to address that in a proper way. Finally, on the foreign investment question, many European cities are used to having their role as provincial provincial economic hubs. We're not all Amsterdams and Frankfurts and Parises. This does create risks. There's efficiency and centralization tendencies in the big multinational companies, even if they're European owned, and this reduces the capacities, which risks reducing the capacities of local and regional producers. Just look at what happened to post offices across Europe. And this is a thing that I think we have to address quite seriously in this question of foreign investment. Of course, we need the investment money in many areas, but we have to be very careful about how it's controlled and where it's applied.
Great, thank you very much. So you're raising two really big issues. One there is about, as it were, the externalities associated with foreign direct investment and perhaps even the dominance of certain sources of that investment. And the second point, of course, was whether there's a policy tension between freedom of movement and cohesion policy more generally, and particularly the regional development aspects of that. Shelka, we might ask you for a little comment on that before we come back to our researchers, as it's quite a fundamental issue.
Well, connectivity and mobility certainly plays a big role. How it will all be put together and what is the best way to address this with the post-2020 cohesion policy, this remains to be seen, but it's certainly one of the issues that is on the table.
Great, okay. Now, Maria, you were the person who raised this issue about how can disadvantaged regions really succeed in FDI? And the way you asked the question, you gave half the answer. Why don't you give the full answer now, in your opinion?
I didn't realise I was going to have to answer my own question.
Ah, it's always the way, I'm afraid.
I'll be more careful from here on in.
Yeah. Could I just ask for the conversations that are happening in the room to stop? Because there's a lot of noise going on. Thank you. Carry on.
I suppose I am coming from my own experience within Ireland, where we have been successful in attracting foreign direct investment. So if you go back to when we changed our industrial policy back in the 50s, so it was very much an incentive-based approach where we wanted to attract, at that point in time, manufacturing operations, understanding that supply chains were beginning to be disaggregated. We had a well-educated workforce, a high unemployment rate, and we also introduced our tax regime as an incentive, as well as direct grant aid that was available at that point in time. In addition, the state also invested in advanced property solutions. So we had a package of offering to FDI at that point in time. I think it's become a more complex sell. It's become much more sophisticated. It really is now about understanding the particular needs of the company, the particular motives for their FDI, and then to tailor your responses accordingly. So I suppose we would be a more developed economy in that regard in Ireland, and we still need to be constantly assessing and reassessing the needs of enterprise. We are finding now that foreign direct investment that we would attract as a developed economy will tend to go towards the urban areas, certainly where there is access to talent. So your universities and research centres are key draws. So in that regard, I think we're possibly seeing and potentially a greater disparity, if you want to use that phrase. And we now need to assert what particular, in this new, we had a lot of conversation earlier about digitalisation, a lot around, I suppose, renewable energy. So is there a different way now that we need to be start to look at locational or territorial assets in a way that will answer to the needs of companies that are making location choices as to where they want to base their entities, and from Ireland's perspective it is to serve the European market. Right. So I don't have all the answers.
No, but the point you're making is a little bit like the point that Peter was making in relation to population movements, that FDI in a sense is a market-driven activity, and therefore it does present some big challenges. Panellists, another final chance for you to comment, perhaps on either this question about FDI and disadvantaged regions, or the next question about SMEs in Europe and whether SMEs play the same role here as they play in other countries. Who'd like to do a last comment before I invite Manuela, Bernd and Julian back to the stage?
Yeah, I'm happy to start off in relation to Adriana's question. I can't comment on outside of Europe, but certainly in my region, what is the role of SMEs? For me, the answer is absolutely huge. 95% of Coventry and Warwickshire's business base are small or micro businesses. And they play a crucial role, particularly in supplying the larger companies, particularly in my region, original equipment manufacturers, such as Jaguar Land Rover. In the future of the economy, I think they have an increasing role to play. From a public policy standpoint, they also, for me, play a vital role because it's where I think the greatest areas of market failure are in terms of, in my region, there's a long tail of businesses that are not innovating enough, that are not engaging in R&D. Well, that market failure is predominantly focused on SMEs and where there's the most untapped potential. And at the moment, ERDF focuses very much on supporting SMEs, not large businesses. For me, that focus is largely right because it's proven where the market failure is. However, I think the challenge is longer term, and for me, it should be the focus of where future innovation and business support policy should be.
Great. Thank you very much, David. Peter and Anina, any comments to add on any of these three questions from you? No? Anina? No? Okay. Željka, would you like to add anything particularly on this question about Europe?
I just want to throw in a number on SMEs, and which resonates with how important they are. In this programming period, we will be helping 1.1 million different SMEs. So this gives you an
idea of the
scale.
Yes.
Yeah.
Great, very important. So Manuela, Bernd and Julian, you have a right of reply, a right to comment, 1 or 2 statements each. Either come to here or a handheld microphone will come to you. Have we got a handheld microphone there? Well, why don't we take this one? So, thank you. Manuela, a quick statement, if you don't mind.
Yeah. Well, there are 2 things I wanted to underline. The first is about high-skill mobility. It is true that it is a risk, but it is also a positive thing if these high-skilled people then bring back something in their country of origin, either coming back or creating networks, supporting business development in their region. There are some good examples. We did one of our case studies. There was a scientist coming back to his region, which is very underdeveloped, and started up a very high-level scientific hub. So this could be a way. The other thing is this issue about local capacity. This is very important, and it must be strengthened, and it must be working with national and European institutions. They cannot be left alone in inventing their own strategies. It doesn't work.
Manuela, thank you very much. Bernd, some reflections from you? And then afterwards, Julian, a reflection from you.
Thanks. Yeah, I just want to return to this second question here. Yes. Although, of course, I don't have the figures at the top of my head, what SME means in the US or so. But it points actually at an issue which was also raised from the remarks here, that we are running the risk that we are constantly comparing and trying to copy desperately successful strategies for SMEs. I'm quite sure that everywhere in the world, the status and the importance, the relative economic importance of SMEs is pretty much the same. However, the roles, of course, they are playing in the economic backbone, they are different. And we shouldn't run the risk, and this was also here reflected, that we confuse SME support policy with innovation policy all the time. We will never ever succeed in kind of repeating Silicon Valley or Tel Aviv. And the reason is very simple. The European idea about risk-taking is fundamentally different. In Tel Aviv or in Silicon Valley, you have an outfall, an economic outfall degree of 30%, meaning every euro invested in an SME there is to 30% lost. Imagine that in a European setting, especially in the sense of funding, that 30% of our cohesion funds are simply to be written off. Nobody would do that, right? But this is the spirit you have in these areas, and this is not to be repeated. And this is also what we can see from the study here. And this is what I meant when I said you have to adapt to the regional circumstances and the political circumstances, that risk-taking and innovation is not always the thing. And SME support is also possible, and we can see that the majority of SMEs is not dealing with high-class innovation. They are simply grocery stores, or they are handicraft people, and this is why I insisted so much on the quadruple helix approach, that very often they are based in tacit knowledge of the people on the ground, and not so much of high-tech stuff derived from universities.
Thank you so much, Ben. Can we give the microphone to Julien? Any reflection from you, Julien?
Yeah, just 3 points related to FDI. And the first one that has been mentioned in the panel was also the importance of the talent. And also having interviews with a couple of case studies, we're asking about tax incentive. And that's to some extent important, but it's not the crucial factor. What they need is to, for instance, a Japanese company to move to Europe, and they have to find where in Europe they can find the talent they need to develop that product. They will not, for instance, go to a specific country in Europe because of tax incentive if the talent is absent. So the talent is the key. The second one is also when you talk about FDI, some of us might have the idea that it's a big multinational coming from the US coming to Latvia, for instance, but most of them are actually SMEs. And they look for bigger partners or these hidden champions. For instance, there are many of those in Germany, in order to cooperate and to bring new products thanks to this cooperation. And again, they come to that specific part of Europe in the search for talent. And the last one related to this question about disadvantaged regions is also quite important to see what these disadvantaged regions have as an asset. For instance, I remember talking to some Japanese companies moving to Germany, and they first thought about Munich, but then having an office in Munich is quite costly, and also when it comes to traffic in Munich, it might take more time. And they found out establishing in the rural part of Bavaria was a much better location for them. Also, to the fact that a lot of engineers are living in the rural part of Bavaria. Then Bavaria might be an extreme example to some extent, but yeah, we should also think about the assets of these so-called disadvantaged regions when it comes to FDI. Yeah.
Julien, thank you very much indeed. Now, we're going to move on in a minute, but before we do that, let me put these 2 big questions that we've been debating to the vote here. And I'm going to phrase it this way. Do we know what is needed for disadvantaged regions to really succeed in FDI? If you think we do know, please raise your hands now. Ha ha. If you think we don't know, please raise your hands now. Okay, so and who didn't vote for some reason or another? Let's just see those. Otherwise, it's a bit incoherent. Okay, so 80% of the room thinks we don't know. 0% of the room thinks we do know. And about 20% didn't vote for some reason or another. Picking up the role of SMEs in Europe versus the rest of the world, Bernd's comment was that we shouldn't try to copy what appears to be models of success from America or Israel. Who agrees that we should not try to copy those models? If you agree, please raise your hands. Okay, nice and high so we can see. Who does not agree and thinks we should try to copy those models? Okay, thank you. Okay, so not everybody voted, but it's about 95-5 in that regard. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you again to our 3 speakers on the economic and employment issues. We're now going to planning and governance, and I'm going to ask the panelists again to give their reflections. Which were the policy ideas that you thought were most important? Which ones are relevant to the environment you're in? What might be some of the barriers? And Peter, we're going to ask you to start this time, and we're going to come down the table this way so we can pass that. Okay.
Hello?
Keep talking.
Hello? Okay. Thanks again for some excellent presentations. You all kept the deadline. It was brilliant. There's a lot of very high resonance here for our work. I work in planning, regional planning for Oslo region. And especially the presentation from Vanya was very good in that respect. There's a lot of important issues that came out from the other ones. I liked the presentation, especially from Actera, from Erik Løschen. Moving on from fuzzy cooperation and the emphasis on building institutional capacity, which is always forgotten. I mean, there's so much more policy material which is easier to sell, environmental interventions, huge infrastructure investments. But in a lot of cases, what really matters is getting the long-term institutional capacity, the stability which you need to create the confidence in the political environment to work together rather than just working for your own territorial area, whether it's a municipality or a region. Yeah. This is the real challenge. And I think the cities that have taken part in the work that Vanya has been leading for us in the SPIMA project, some of them have shown that they've been able to get there, but there's still a lot of work to do, especially in some of the newer member states, I would say. The Compass project, mapping out for the first time for 17 years is very interesting. I'm sure there'll be a lot of good material coming out of that. I noted something on that one which was interesting. Sorry. Yeah, the idea of avoiding spatial blindness that came out of one of these, that is a very important matter. Of course, as a planner, we like everybody to say that. But it's, in the end, when you look at the different issues, we look at the regional governance level. It can be transport, it can be the environment, it can be housing. In the end, a lot of the key decisions do come down to where things happen. And that is about planning decisions. It's about public or private investments, often in a huge scale, and these decisions have to be made through the rational planning systems. The question of the inner periphery is a little bit peripheral from my work, but I would say that Oslo, like Helsinki and others, we're also working in a peripheral part of Europe, and I think a lot of what we're doing here, this idea of living labs, this could have a role in these widespread inner peripheral regions as well. I think this idea of a test bed in areas a bit far out from the big markets could be very, very interesting. I think that the main message that I really got from 2 or 3 of the presentations, again coming back to it, was the need for working harder at building up the institutional capacity to do regional governance in a good way. It doesn't happen on its own. It requires a lot of political confidence to get this work done. I've been working in this for 25 years, and it takes a lot of guts for a vice mayor to go out and invite the neighbour and say, well, we're open to discussions on the bits of land in our territory. But sometimes they do that. But to get that far, they have to have the confidence that the apparatus around them will carry on working within the legal framework. There is the funding when it's needed, and there is the stability for them to be able to do that. Great. So I would say that's the main message.
Great, thank you very much. David, please.
Yeah, no problem. Yeah, I picked up as well a number of points. I think it was from Vanya's presentation, and again I sort of come back to the UK where we've seen talking about no single definition of a metropolitan area. We've seen a lot of change just in terms of regional structure. For example, the government abolished regional development agencies in 2010, moved to local enterprise partnership areas, now increasingly moving to combined authority areas, which are probably on a geographical scale in the middle of the former two. I think it's safe to say, how do you define a functional economic area? It's very much still the holy grail. We're still looking for the answer in the United Kingdom. Short-term funding, rightly identified as an issue as well, another challenge. And I think the points around the need for strong governance, strong leadership, degrees of flexibility, certainly resonate from as well the findings that are coming out of the Resi project too. And it clearly talks about the importance of a local authority sort of as a broker. I mean, just picking up on the second question on the screen there about economic development policy and spatial planning, I think increasingly what the RESI report says is local areas are potentially increasingly becoming test beds for new products, technologies. The local authority has a vital role to play as a facilitator, and I think it's inevitable that the spatial planning system also needs to work for economic development. That's what we're seeing.
Great. Okay, thank you very much. Nina, what were your reflections listening to these presentations?
Not surprisingly, I very much like the ACT area policy pitch because we're the lead stakeholder, so this explains that.
You're not suggesting there's favoritism at play?
Not at all.
No.
So what I thought about ACT area, what a really interesting reflection is on general terms is this question about what role on which level. So we as a national level, what is actually our role in this promoting soft territorial cooperation? And I think this is one of the important questions that we're asking us now with this research in our hands. And I think we'll have to work quite a bit with this question. Also, the capacity building and facilitation, I think, is a very important point because often we have a tendency to just throw out some concepts into the wild and hoping that it's going to get picked up and that people are going to do something with it. But often, well, there are, of course, those people that will just take something and build a new cooperation out of it. But often, if we just had some facilitation and capacity building on the regional level especially, often those concepts actually would be picked up much faster and would produce intrinsic initiatives much faster. Also very interesting is, of course, the SPIMA project. We had one of the cities, I think, was Zurich, participating. They thought it was quite interesting. I had a chat with them some days ago. Then Compass, of course, I'm very much looking forward to this study. I think that's probably a very interesting study. I'm very curious because I think spatial planning is something very cultural at the same time. So I think this will probably be represented in this study, the different cultural implications in spatial study in Europe. Innerperipheries, a big topic in Switzerland with the mountain regions. I think we're definitely benefit from this study because we are constantly trying to avoid having those innerperipheries with public transport accessibility and trying to have economic development in our whole country. There is actually a policy on rural spaces where innerperipheries are also a topic. And what also I thought was quite interesting is that actually ACT area and RESI seem to have kind of a lot of similarities. I think these two studies probably will be interesting to read next to one another, and I think we will be able to benefit from one another.
Great.
So yeah, that's from my side.
Anina, thank you very much indeed. Maria, your thoughts?
My thoughts. I suppose maybe just to say, by way of context, our own department is working very closely with our Department of Environment and Planning, who are currently finalising the national planning framework and leading then to regional, spatial and economic strategies. I suppose from my perspective, what I'm seeing as a common theme throughout all is the importance and the attractiveness of place to encourage business investment and to create places that are attractive for people to live and work in. So it's that interplay between the attractiveness of place and economic development. And from my perspective, I know we talk a lot here about cooperation, but is from an enterprise policy perspective, better understanding the planning process, and from a planning perspective, better understanding economics. So I keep coming back to that chicken and egg, but we're living in that world. I think what was very interesting here, I suppose, was one conversation around the functional areas, and again, better understanding what we mean by functional areas and overcoming administrative boundaries. With that in mind, I think the processes, the methods for cooperation and collaboration, concepts of facilitation were pervasive across all. And again, I think hugely important if we are to realise the objectives for spatial planning. The other area when we talk about capacity, institutional capacity and building capacity and collaboration, one of the key things I think that we also need to maybe put on the table and discuss is mindset change. You can tend to come across individuals with either a very defined sectoral objective, a territorial ownership, and that maybe inability to think beyond boundaries. And I think part of the facilitation process needs to consider that mindset shift. So how do we manage to do that in terms of either creating a compelling proposition? Is there a funding incentive behind that? But I just think that there are other interesting areas, and they were all stimulated, I think, by the discussions we've had here.
Great, thank you very much indeed, Maria. Shelke, your reflections, please.
Let me start with the notion of flexible strategies, which was mentioned by both Resi and by Vanya. We had our shot at trying to come up with these flexible strategies under our sustainable urban development or territorial development strategies, where we were also after some kind of a basic strategies that could continue evolving, but instead those strategies ended up being highly institutionalized and passed through several approval levels, and now are sort of set in stone and not being any longer this flexible. So this flexibility issue is very important, and it's something we will try to pursue given the pace of change and given the fact that new challenges are constantly evolving. I would like to link this to the spatial planning and what was said on that issue. This is also a discipline that is very much challenged these days. It used to be a multidisciplinary discipline, but now with all these new concepts emerging, like circular economy, nature-based solutions, climate change-driven concepts, they're up for new challenges. And yesterday at the ESPON Monitoring Committee, we heard an interesting example from Netherlands, where they are trying to introduce climate change aspects into their spatial planning. We also have a Copernicus tool, which is now advertised also through Euronews, which comes from European Environmental Agency, which provides real-time data on air pollution, which is incorporated into the planning exercise over there in Copenhagen for now. So I like the notion of the living labs and continuous evolvement of all these approaches. Let me also tackle a bit, somebody mentioned, I think it's also Rice's study, project-relevant alliances. We had an attempt, we had an attempt. It was somewhat similar, but certainly we could improve along these lines. You know, our ITI tool, Integrated Territorial Investment, was also designed as a rather flexible tool. However, it again experienced some gold plating at the national level, which pointed at also some of the studies mentioned, the lack of trust between the different government levels. So I like also the notion of facilitation between different government. This is something certainly we could further pursue and look into. I'll go back to metropolitan areas, where also very interesting things were mentioned, that they should be clusters of administrative bodies, which is also what we experience, you know, because metropolitan areas with firm borders are no longer there, because rationale before was defining them as a commuter zone areas, but now with circular economy, the metropolitan area becomes something else. With another concept, it becomes something else. So this notion of building alliances around concepts or around projects, it's a very good one, and I'll try and put it forward within our post-2020 planning.
Great. Željka, these are very helpful and very well-informed observations. Panel, we have a short period of time. We must have a discussion about question number 1 here. How can we avoid territorial blindness if the decision makers aren't interested in territorial evidence and their perspective remains sectoral? I'd like a couple of you to comment on that. Who'd like to comment? Peter, do you want to? So let's get one microphone down that end, and we'll have one at this end. So, Željko, you hold on to that one for a minute. Peter, a quick comment on that, if you would.
Okay, based on the experience from our own region and those who we've cooperated in through the Eurocities network, which is behind the SPIMA project, a lot of the collaboration starts on transportation issues in the metropolitan area and scale. Linking up buses, trams, local trains across the city borders, often across regional borders. These are institutional issues. It's about funding agreements. It's a lot of negotiations. But in the end, a lot of cities get there. Even cities such as Vienna, which has to deal with separate states as soon as you cross the city border. Once you start looking at transport, you suddenly involve a lot of other issues. What is at the end of the line? Is it a housing area? Is it a long way from the housing area? Are you passing through industrial areas? And all these other questions start coming in. It's related to industrial policy. It becomes very quickly related to housing policy. And it very quickly ends up being a discussion about the overall spatial structure. Now, spatial policy is not just about land use planning. Spatial policy, in my view, it's about the whole dynamics of the way locations change and evolve in our case, in a metropolitan area. So I think once you start really working seriously on maybe one issue, it could also be housing, for example, then you very quickly start involving the other issues. We did a bit of planning in Oslo and Akershus, which was looking at land use and transport. But to get there, we had to do studies on housing, we had to do studies on economic development, even local government financing, which is the Achilles heel in a lot of regions. If you get that one wrong, people won't cooperate. So there's a lot of things that suddenly start playing in once you do the work seriously.
Great, thank you very much, Peter. Now, what I want to do, if we may, is I want to get Željko to comment on this question. Then Maria and David, I want you to comment on the next one very briefly. And then Anina, I want you to comment on the third one there, about the inner peripheries, yeah? So Željko, can you pick up this question about territorial blindness? What's your reflections on that?
I was actually going to also comment on the second one.
Okay, do that. Do that as quickly as you can.
Yeah. You know, I'm from the urban territorial unit. We are all for place-based approach.
But you deal with ministries that are not place-based.
Yeah,
so
we are still in a silo, sectorial world all over within the Commission as well, I must admit.
Yes.
And bringing up even more forward the territorial agenda is a constant and ongoing challenge. Let's see where we end up.
Any advice to them out there? How do you get people in sectoral ministries to think about place?
We provide them training on territorial impact assessment tool that ESPON designed for us, and which is, although rather rough and still undergoing improvements, it's a great tool to apply to any decision, policy decision, strategic decision, and it demonstrates a territorial value added. So that's one way to go around it, and keep on preaching and showing the benefit of place-based approach, which brings out, somebody mentioned, indigenous potential, and this is all we want to see.
Good. I think everybody in the room agrees with you. Do you want to say anything else about question 2?
I wanted to say a question too. So this is the struggle. We have no influence over spatial planning. It's a national exercise. However, our two place-based integrated strategic approaches, smart specialization strategy and integrated sustainable development strategies, they will both kind of vouch for similar values, what we see coming out of the studies, simplifications, adaptability, multi-sectorial, multi-governance approaches, participatory approach. So they all go hand in hand, but this should be somehow emphasized even more so in future.
Thank you very much. Maria and David, quick reflections on this question. You've both commented on it already, but what's your golden nugget here?
Okay, well, I'd say we're not there yet.
Yeah.
However, I was involved in developing Ireland's national enterprise policy, Enterprise 2025, and within that we identified 4 areas in which Ireland could become internationally differentiated, and one area was placemaking alongside talent, innovativeness and connectedness. And the connectedness brings into account trade as well as national connectedness through digital, for example, or digitalisation. We would see the national planning framework that, as I say, is being developed by one of our colleagues as one of the most important economic strategies ever, and we have stated that, and through the lips of our minister, and we're involved in an interdepartmental committee to make that happen. And this year, for the first time ever, our capital investment programme has been extended to a 10-year rolling capital plan, and each and every government department is asked now to align its funding priorities to the national planning framework. So we're on the way.
Great, you are indeed on the way. David, quick reflections?
Yeah, as I said earlier, you know, in my view in the UK, I think economic development policy and spatial planning are, you know, becoming increasingly integrated. You know, just a few examples locally. For example, we have strategic economic plans in all of our local enterprise areas, which talk about, for example, enhancing the digital infrastructure, enhancing the physical innovation infrastructure, as well as talking about SME support. Also, you know, an example of how we're integrating economic development policy and spatial planning, we have an independent planning advisor within the Coventry and Warwickshire Growth Hub, which is our flagship business support function, and recently as well as examples where we've made the planning system work to make sure we get flagship new innovation facilities. For example, an £80 million national battery prototyping facility at Warwick Manufacturing Group announced last week. So we're increasingly getting the spatial planning system to try and work better for economic development.
Great. Now, Peter's not going to forgive me if I don't allow him one sentence on this.
I'm just going to write it on here instead. Don't miss 6th of February next year, final conference for the SPEMA project. You'll all be invited.
Great. And that's in Oslo, is it?
It's in Brussels.
In Brussels. Great. Anina, Innerperipheries. Do you have any evidence of the specific potential? You mentioned the mountainous areas in Switzerland. What do you know about them?
So yeah, in Switzerland, our peripheries are mostly the mountain areas. So this is why we, of course, potentials and opportunities are kind of easy to find because, of course, it's tourism. So, but then again, we have climate change. Snow is coming later. Snow is becoming less. So the question is, do we want to rely solely on making our mountains a tourist industry, and what's going to happen when snow is gone? So we're constantly reassessing. We actually have an economic department working on strategies to keep those mountain areas as livable as possible. Of course, in the same time, we've talked about the post offices disappearing from everywhere, especially from the peripheries in all Europe. Switzerland is also very much in that situation, so that means mountain valleys have less and less services of general interest. But still, we're looking for solutions. There's the Alpine Space Program. It's an Interreg program. We have many projects with our neighboring countries being in the same situation, and I'm very confident that we're looking for potentials, finding opportunities, and that we'll try to overcome this inner periphery situation.
Great, thank you very much indeed. Now, we've got to give a very quick right of reply to Eric, Vanya, Vincent, Joanne, and Kevin. So please come up. You can have less than 1 minute on the microphone each to give us some reflections, and then we'll go immediately to the final part of the session. Just some quick reflections, if you would.
Thank you.
Yeah.
It's a very useful exercise, seeing what messages you get through and what is difficult to get through.
Yeah.
It is. We didn't have 3 minutes, so well. I want to get back to the notion of functional areas. David talked about it as the Holy Grail. Maria wondered what is meant with them. I would really argue it's not your job to answer that. I think it is the issue is really to just focusing on the processes, making sure people have the capacity to explore themselves what is their functional areas in different functional areas, that they overlap, they vary depending on the issue, and then letting it develop, and they will emerge, they will adapt, and they will be flexible, as I said, functioning in a complementary way to the established regions. In a way, what we are doing is a complement to the SPIMA project. Metropolitan areas somehow establish firm attempts at building up a functional area, if you like. But it has downsides of merging. You are metropolitan or you're not. Well, it doesn't really function like that, especially for areas that are on the margins of metropolitan areas or in between, and they also need to position their functional areas. So I think these two projects are very much complementary, and we need to consider them in relation to each other.
Great. Eric, thank you very much. Vincent, I think you're next.
Hello again, everyone. Well, following on from the functional regions, we've identified in our project many interesting initiatives, and we've heard some from Vanya and Eric and others today. And that's all very good, but these are soft initiatives. They're often described as soft initiatives. They lie outside the mainstream planning system, and often they're bypassing the mainstream planning system. At the same time, I think next summer we're going to report that the statutory planning systems are becoming much weaker. Their influence on development is becoming weaker. We know why that is, because of neoliberal politics and the way things are going there. But that is where legitimacy and accountability is hosted. And I think bypassing the system is a mistake. And we need to pay attention to the statutory formal systems and see if we can strengthen them. I understand the point from the EU that, and we hear it many, many times, we don't have any influence on spatial planning systems. In fact, next year we will also be reporting that the EU, as we all know, has huge impacts on the way planning systems work through its sector policy. But I think that's enough for now.
That's for another day, but fantastic point. Vanya, please, little comment from you.
Thank you for the interesting discussion. It's nice to hear a reflection on the work that we did. Yeah, I just wanted to say we also were looking at these definitions of metropolitan areas. It is not that we are aiming, it's not a goal in itself to go on to suburbanize more and more and more. No, it is on how to manage these areas, because these developments are happening in reality, and so we want to know what we need to manage it in a sustainable way. So whether economic, environmental, or social issues are at place in each area. So it's not a policy goal to be metropolitan.
No.
In our project we also identified via a number of interviews with actors from our case cities, what are the key triggers and incentives that can play a role to actually stimulate this shared governance process and to bridge the statutory practices of spatial planning with more flexible governance approach. And we came up with some interesting list of triggers. And one of the first thing in mind to think about is, the triggers are also Peter mentioned about the transportation system as an example. That's also in other urban trends. What are the win-win situations? So for some actors, this will be, like for businesses, for example, and developers, this will be what do I win here in talking to policymakers and spatial planners. And for others, more like the policy officers and planners will be, how can we achieve this in a more sustainable way? Because that's more the public interest. So it is really to understand this interdependency between the different actors and win-win situations. And so we try to develop this, what I show in the figure, this approach that at least you have to think starting from definition to identifying the win-win situations and governance models and give it a structure. And I agree with Željka that we need a facilitation process here. And actually the next steps will be working on creating these incentives and triggers, picking them up, and maybe we can have progress in this.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Could you give the microphone to Joanne, please?
Thank you very much. Okay. Innerperipheries, this is an initial approach to the problem at the European scale. So we are discovering the concept during the development of the project, and the concept tells us that this is not only about lagging remote rural areas, but interperipherality can happen anywhere in Europe, it is not only about geographical factors, it is also about power and connectedness. And power and connectedness are, let's say, the weak points of many inner peripheries. And this is where strategies are for many peripheries, inner peripheries. There is a paradox between the territorial assets of inner peripheries and the capacity they have to retain population and economy. So strategies could also work on that paradox because they are very attractive territories from that point of view that are not able to keep the population because they have been losing economy and losing population for a long time due to lacks of access to services, etc. And finally, solutions go also on this highlighted idea of the multi-level governance, which has to be done in a right way. And this is a whole story that I don't have time to tell now.
No, great. But
Thank you very much.
We hope you will. Thank you, Joanne. Could you give the microphone to Kevin, please? And Kevin, a reply or a response from you?
I haven't got a major sort of response really. I agree with almost everything that people have said. In terms of collaboration and institutional thickness, I agree. I think that the aspiration's always been there, and I think everybody has that as a goal. But I think the realities come crashing down on us quite often from our case studies, particularly the smaller municipalities in Southern Europe. The context of austerity brings about a defence mechanism for a lot of small municipalities in a period where the accountability of those small municipalities is all about making sure they don't lose services. And therefore, you know, in a way, that collaboration brings a lot of potential risks. And we live in a very risk-averse, accountable sort of you know, local political system at the moment. Another issue really is that thing about the national level, you know, creating the framework or constraints, some might say, in which the rest of the subnational level has to operate. Coming from the UK, you know, we're very aware of that. We're going through a process at the moment, particularly in David's area, where, again, getting to a point of who does what at what scale, you know, we're having changes where those things are now being blurred again. So it's you know, I agree wholeheartedly with all these points.
Great, Kevin, thank you very much indeed. Colleagues, I think we're getting right to the meat of some of these issues, aren't we, to do with space, geography, planning, land, peripherality, equality, exclusion, inclusion, and how that interacts with broader processes of economy, capital flows, and everything else. And I guess if we had another 4 hours, we'd really get to the bottom of all of it. But we've only got another 9 minutes. So what we're going to do is we're going to have quick reflections from you on the two projects that addressed the environmental and the resource issues, territories and the low-carbon economy, and then possible European territorial futures. Shelka, I'm going to ask you to begin with your reflections. We'll go back along the line, and then we'll have just 1 or 2 minutes for conversation before we wind up.
Well, we definitely need to step up our efforts here in reaching the targets on low carbon. The results may be a little bit misleading because for the moment it looks as most member states will be reaching their 2020 targets, but this was by large facilitated by the crisis and decline of economic activity. So now with picking up, this may be put in jeopardy. And not to say that the targets for 2030 will be even higher, so we really need to step up our efforts. We are currently reflecting on how COP21 and sustainable development goals would be reflected in a post-2020 cohesion policy. We are also looking at finding further alignment between socio-economic agenda and environmental and climate change agenda. We are aware that awareness of climate change and the need to transition to sustainability has picked up, and it's by now increasingly acknowledged. But how the society can achieve actually such a transition, this knowledge still remains rather fragmented, and something needs to be done there. Coming back to Kai and territoriality, Well, again, I'm from the unit that by large advocates the territorial dimension. We even elaborated, you know, there is this constant struggle between thematically driven framework, policy-driven framework, and territorially driven framework. So we made an attempt and made a sort of a matrix of thematic-driven framework with intersecting with a territorial-driven framework. And we thought it was great, but our hierarchy thought it's too complex in the light of the fact that we are trying to simplify everything. So this is still a very much a struggle. And let's see how much further we can get. The territorial dimension will be certainly increased in the next programming period, but to what extent and whether the thematic policy framework or thematic framework will prevail or a policy objectives framework, this still remains to be seen.
Very interesting. A live debate as well right now. Maria?
I don't have an awful lot to add, I suppose, at this point in time, but I was very interested in the findings. I suppose from our perspective, again, we do realise that achieving the targets 2020 and 2030 are really challenging. And it does have implications for our enterprise policy and certainly provides great opportunities and potential, particularly in terms of RD&I and looking at new technologies, new products and services. I was interested in the findings here in terms of the contrast with PV generation, that there was hardly any change in the areas with the high solar potential. And I think getting in behind that to better understand why not would be hugely informative. It does talk about the importance of local and regional cooperation, and certainly in investments that are relating to renewables does really require strong citizen engagement throughout the entire process. I mean, we've seen it in Ireland with the establishment of wind farms, for example, so it is a hugely important. So I just thought that was an interesting finding. In terms of the foresighting, I'm just very interested in that as a process. I think it's a tremendous process for maybe shifting mindsets from the sort of what has the data told us and where is it going to bring us to the future to sort of allowing for some lateral critical thinking. And I think that's a very positive process. And I think perhaps from a policy making perspective, we need to engage more in that type of approach.
Great, thank you very much indeed. Anina?
Thank you very much. I'm going to keep my intervention rather short, so I'm not going to say much to locate. I think it's a very interesting study, very interesting, this difference of photovoltaic being used in places where sunshine is not such a frequent happening. Then regarding the territorial foresight, I think this is a very interesting study. I mean, we can see that now in the ESPON studies with Alps 2050 also being a foresight study. So I think also national levels, we often do that. We just conducted a foresight study regarding mobility patterns in the future, where we've also exploited some of the ideas about independent mobility in the future, cars without drivers, etc. So I think this is something that we should do, and it's very interesting to think about what's going to happen in regard to digitalization, as we've talked about this morning. So yeah, that's from me.
Great, thank you very much. David?
Okay, thanks. Yeah, I think some of the points, particularly that Kai raised, go back to Eric's earlier point about needing to be more flexible around the notion of functional economic areas. The other reflection I had, we talked about the planning system in the previous session. It also seems to me like, you know, we need to make the energy and power supply system, particularly around renewable energy, you know, work for future economic development, economic growth needs of our economy, and also the needs of our residents. You know, for example, renewable energy provision, you know, still for me a key element of our innovation ecosystem, and I agree that I think there's a need to build capacity to see, you know, where does this best fit within the economic development strategy. But I think also there's a need to fully explore opportunities and costs at various levels in terms of you know, making the renewable energy system work better for the economy. And just picking up on the second question here, which I think is a good one. around cohesion funding. That, you know, for me, there's particularly a need to fully explore the opportunities around enhancing the renewable energy ecosystem, looking at the cost, but also, as part of the opportunities, the development of new green products and technologies is an economic opportunity moving forward. Some of ERDF Priority 4 in England has looked at ways of doing that. I think there's a need to look at what's worked well, what hasn't worked well, and build on the opportunities of that. And some of that I see being hard quantitative evidence and some being softer evidence.
Very good. Peter, can you take the other microphone, pass that one back down here? Just to let you know where we are, we're going to be finished in about 5 minutes, but it's going to be a quick sequence to get us there. Peter's going to give us his comments. Sjelka's going to comment on the 2 questions that have been raised. I'm going to open the voting for the finale. Then I'm going to invite Bernd and Kai to give their reactions, and we'll be done at 4:05, okay? So let's stay with it. Here we go.
I'll be very quick. First, I have a huge respect for energy expertise in regard to finding sustainable energy solutions. It's not my field. Having said that, Oslo did take part, together with our neighbours in Akershus, in an 18 Metropolitan Region collaboration project 6 years ago, EU CO2 it was called, in the Metrex network, which actually exposed huge differences in the opportunities to reach low-carbon goals between the participating cities, including Helsinki, not so far from here. Norway is a unique situation in the international context. We're a major producer of both hydroelectricity, which is more than enough for what we need, and, of course, fossil fuels to the rest of Europe. Renewable energy meets a lot of local opposition. It takes a lot of space, and it's often in areas that have high landscape sensitivity. This, I think, is one of the big planning issues which we have to confront. My third point is I'm unsure about the role of nuclear power. I'm sure this is not politically correct to say, but I'm not saying it for that reason. Countries such as Finland and France are very heavily dependent on nuclear power. They haven't chosen the same path as Germany, and they haven't got the same opportunities to do that. I'd be very interested to see how that might play out. Looking ahead, we do face some very big strategic choices, but also in the background of different path dependencies. Energy choices that our countries made 50 or even 100 years ago are still very much with us. Is it realistic to think about power networks as a whole across Europe? I think the indications were probably no. But perhaps to move it forward from just thinking about 27 or 28 national energy policies, we should rather consider power balances across and between the macro regions. I think the Baltic macro region work that has been done, Baltic, which includes Norway, is a very important piece of work. There are huge discrepancies, but I think there are some important linkages, because this is at least at a scale where energy transfer is a reality. Between the north of Europe and Spain, for example, is not a reality, but at least within this context it could be possible. We have the Danube region, the Alpine region has been referred to, and so on. This could be an important way forward to start looking a little bit more across the different national policies.
Thank you very much, Peter. Very thoughtful. Send the microphone back down here, if you will. Sjelka, please make some brief comments on these 2 key questions, if you don't mind.
Sure. I think the question on should the cohesion funding be used for regions lagging in the transition to low-carbon economy, this brings out really an important issue. We are in a sort of a dichotomy world. In a sense, we are still pursuing the imperative of economic growth at no matter what is the cost on economy, especially in lagging regions. And we more associate transition to low-carbon economy with more advanced regions. How to bridge this gap and how to turn it around, it's very much a challenge. And I think what I mentioned before, that we are trying to align socio-economic, environmental and climate change agendas in one single agenda, which may be a way forward here.
Great, thank you very much indeed. Now, before I invite Kai and Bernd to give their comments, we're going to open the final voting. And here we're asking you to tell us what you thought of what you've just heard. I'll just let everybody know that we're not going to make some kind of ranking public at the end. What we are going to do is tell you who's won in each of the categories, and that's all. And those will be our winners. So there's going to be 3 different questions. You're going to be asked to vote on the policy recommendation that you think should be adopted or implemented as a priority. That will be the first vote. The second one will be the policy recommendation that would have the most significant impact in your region, wherever that is. And then the third one is the most inspirational pitch. And if we could start that voting now, and if while the voting is going on, I could invite Bernd and Kai to give any reactions to what they just heard very briefly, I'd be really grateful. So Bernd, will you come and take the microphone first? So you vote, they speak.
Right. So I can't vote for myself.
Not at the moment. Although we know in Austria that's common.
Right, exactly. You know Austria. Good. No. So just a quick reaction on the issue with the renewable energy and as was mentioned twice, I think the striking difference here. This is kind of logical, and this is what I wanted to stress with the point that we should bridge or take into consideration very much the governments or the administrational issues of energy. The reason why wind is placed where it is placed is that it's a very centralized type of energy in a way, because it's also built by big energy providers, and it can be easily built, but of course the problem there is the transportation of energy produced, because you need high voltage energy grids to do that, which is a problem, but it's easy. Whereas photovoltaic is a highly decentralized source of energy. It's depending on private people to the most of the extent. And of course, therefore, they are in direct competition with centralized energy providers. And this is what I meant, and this is also the reason why I fully see the dilemma of the European Commission, that in very many cases in energy policy, you don't have a say. You can't change anything. I mean, we can make wishful thinking here and ask for Christmas wishing lists, but you will never break up the market power of energy providers in Europe. And I think there was a saying from the General Director for Energy once, that in terms of energy policy, we are still living in the Middle Ages, and we have our little power fields everywhere which cannot be broken up. And this is, I think, the main dilemma in formatting the transition into renewable energy supply.
Thank you very much, Bernd. Before Kai comes, can we close the first vote and go now immediately to the second vote? Kai, the floor is yours for a quick reaction.
Just give Bernd a second to vote.
Yes.
Well, for the territorial foresight, I agree, there's a lot of foresight around, and at the moment it's very popular. But when we looked into the existing studies, we found very little that is actually going into the territorial diversity of it. Usually it's quite general on certain topics. So what we really tried, and I think what has been proven successful on our 3 cases, is to really find a way how to territorialize it and saying all those foresights then play out differently in different types of territories. And that links to 4 points I heard in your kind of responses. On the one hand, part beyond data, we are often, in particular in ESPON and also statistical analysis, we are bound by the kind of data available. But with the participatory approach, we have a chance to complement that with much more information and go beyond what we see in the kind of statistical data. And that then also links to the participatory process, where it's actually a good way to engage, depending on the level in question, citizens or certain types of experts or policy or decision makers. And we did that, and we invited, well, half of the people that came to our workshops were really coming from our type of activities, knowing the territorial part, and half were coming from different levels, local, regional, national, and from sectors not being comfortable at all talking about territories and talking about Europe. And through the process of one day, we actually got them to discuss the territorial diversity and bring their insights up to that level. So we could capture their capacities. And that links to the topic of capacity building that also was mentioned earlier. We have a tendency to say, well, we need to improve capacity building. But I think we also need to be aware of all the capacity that is there already. So this talk about capacity building always gives the feeling that, oh, those people don't have all the knowledge, but they know a lot of things. And sometimes we just need to find the process to trigger that knowledge and make it useful in the process. And then also in terms of flexibility, in this kind of participatory process, you can adjust and you can rerun an exercise to react more quickly to strategic changes and improve the flexibility. So from that side, I think it's a very useful tool and could be used really from the local to the European level. Also, for instance, to see what the Paris Agreement would mean in territorial terms, as they might also play out quite differently.
Great.
Okay, thanks.
Kai, thank you very much indeed. That's fantastic. Now we're going to close that second vote, please, and go immediately to the final vote while this is going on. And then I'm going to offer some thank yous, give you some instructions, and then we'll wait for the answers or the results of the votes to arrive. So close the second vote and go to the third vote now, please. So, ladies and gentlemen, just to let you know that in the coffee break, which will start very shortly, each of the research teams that are responsible for the 10 projects that you've heard about will be hosting a desk or a table in the coffee area so that you can actually talk to them directly about the research. You can ask for their advice, talk about how it's relevant to your region, your nation, your location, and build some relationships with them and follow up. So please take the opportunity to do that. Please, now at this point, firstly, join me in offering a very big thanks to all of our 10 research leaders who pitched their policy propositions to you this afternoon in a very courageous and very disciplined way. Thank you very much to the research teams. Let's give them a round of applause. And then I also want to pay a particular thank you to our group of panelists. So Jelka Nzaga from DG Regio, Maria Aginity from the ESPON Project Support Team in the Republic of Ireland, Anina Eggenberger from the Swiss Federal Office for Spatial Development, David Hope from Coventry City Council, and Peter Austin from the city of Oslo. Please join me in thanking them, if you will. And then I'm looking for the white smoke that should be coming from the audio-visual desk to tell us the results of the vote. So we're going to close the third vote. And Laurent, are we close to having some responses? We are. Just 1 or 2 seconds. So just talk to your neighbour, but not too loudly, just for a minute, and then we'll have the results for you. I know you've got to go. Lovely to see you.
Thank you very much.
That was fun. Yeah. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, are you ready for the results? Are they all in there? Well done. Well. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, I'm pleased to announce that following a meeting of the Academy here in Tallinn, the nominations have been received, and the first-ranked research teams in each of the following categories were the policy recommendation to be adopted or implemented as a priority. This goes to Professor Vincent Nadin for the Spatial Planning Project. Vincent, congratulations. Now, ladies and gentlemen, very quickly, the policy recommendation that would have the most significant impact in your region, you voted in large numbers. Some of you voted twice, especially if you were from Austria. And the winner is Professor Bernd Schuh for the LowCarbon project. And then, ladies and gentlemen, the final vote was for the most inspirational pitch. They were all inspirational, we know that. But there were some, or one indeed, that you voted to come top, and this goes to Professor Eric Glerson for the Territorial Cooperation Project. Eric, congratulations. So we tried a new format this afternoon. We hope you enjoyed it and found it a good way to hear a lot of information in a short period of time. Tea and coffee are now served. We'll be back here at just after 4:30 to begin the next session. Thank you very much indeed.